David couldn't wait to get home that Friday evening. It had been one of those weeks at the office where every computer seemed to have a different problem, and every user thought their issue was the most important thing in the world. As an IT specialist, he was used to dealing with frustrated people, but today had been particularly rough. All he wanted was to pull into his garage, grab a cold drink, and maybe fire up his PlayStation for a few hours. He'd been living in the quiet suburban neighborhood for about 6 months now. The house wasn't huge, but it was his first real home purchase, and he was proud of it. The garage was one of his favorite features, a nice, secure place to park his car and store his tools and bike. Growing up in an apartment, having his own garage felt like a real achievement. As David turned into his driveway, something looked wrong. The garage door was closed, which was normal, but there was something different about the way it sat. He pressed the button on his garage door opener, and as the door slowly rolled up, his jaw dropped. There, sitting right in the middle of his garage where his car should be, was a shiny silver BMW SUV. Not just any SUV. This thing looked like it cost more than he made in a year. The license plate frame read, "Live, Laugh, Love" in sparkly letters. David sat in his car for a moment, staring at the BMW like it might disappear if he blinked hard enough. But it didn't. It just sat there, taking up his space like it belonged there. He got out of his car and walked around the SUV, looking for any clues about how it got there or who it belonged to. The car was locked, and there was a yoga mat visible in the back seat, along with some reusable shopping bags that screamed, "I shop at Whole Foods." David pulled out his phone and took a few pictures. This was definitely not his car, and it definitely didn't belong in his garage. He tried to think if maybe there was some mistake. Perhaps a neighbor had an emergency and needed to use his garage. But nobody had asked him, and he couldn't think of any reason why someone would just help themselves to his space. Looking around the neighborhood, David tried to figure out which house the BMW might belong to. Most of his neighbors drove more modest cars. A few pickup trucks, some sedans, nothing quite as flashy as this SUV. But then he remembered seeing a similar car parked in front of the house 3 doors down. That was where Linda lived. Linda was the kind of neighbor who made her presence known. She'd introduced herself the day after he moved in, but not in a friendly welcome to the neighborhood way. Instead, she'd shown up with a clipboard and a folder full of HOA rules, explaining all the things he needed to know about maintaining community standards. She'd pointed out that his grass was a little long and suggested he trim his bushes to match the aesthetic vision of the street. Since then, Linda had made several more visits. She'd left notes about his trash cans being visible from the street for too long after pickup day. She'd mentioned that his outdoor Christmas lights in December weren't the approved warm white color. Each time she'd introduced herself as the HOA president, though David had never seen any official documentation proving this. David walked down the street to Linda's house, his frustration building with each step. The house was one of the larger ones on the block, with perfectly manicured landscaping and decorative flags that changed with the seasons. Currently, a fall-themed banner hung from the porch featuring pumpkins and leaves. He rang the doorbell and waited. Through the frosted glass, he could see movement and hear voices. It sounded like Linda was having some kind of dinner party. There was laughter and the clinking of glasses coming from inside. When Linda opened the door, she was dressed up in a nice blouse and holding a wine glass. Behind her, David could see several other people sitting around a fancy dining table with candles and flowers. "Oh, it's you," Linda said, not bothering to hide her annoyance at being interrupted. "What do you need?" David tried to keep his voice calm and polite. "Hi, Linda. I just got home from work and there's a BMW parked in my garage. I think it might be yours." Linda waved her hand dismissively like she was shooing away a fly. "Oh, yes, that. I'm having a dinner party tonight, as you can see. I needed somewhere to park, and I noticed you never use your garage anyway. You always park in your driveway." David blinked, not sure he'd heard correctly. "I'm sorry, what?" "Your garage," Linda repeated, speaking slowly like he was having trouble understanding. "You never park in there. I've been watching, and your car is always in the driveway. So I figured you wouldn't mind if I borrowed the space for tonight. My guests need somewhere safe to park." "But you didn't ask me," David said, his voice rising slightly despite his efforts to stay calm. Linda rolled her eyes. "It's just for tonight. Don't be so dramatic. You can park on the street just this once. It won't kill you." David stood there speechless. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Not only had this woman taken it upon herself to use his private garage without asking, but now she was acting like he was being unreasonable for having a problem with it. "Linda, that's my garage. It's part of my property. You can't just decide to use it because you think I don't need it." "Look," Linda said, clearly getting irritated, "I don't have time for this right now. I have guests waiting. We can talk about it tomorrow, okay?" And with that, she closed the door in his face. David stood on Linda's porch for a moment, staring at the closed door. He could hear the dinner party continuing inside, voices and laughter carrying on like nothing had happened, like he hadn't just discovered someone else's car taking up his space and been dismissed when he tried to address it. Walking back to his house, David felt a mix of anger and disbelief. In 6 months of living here, he'd tried to be a good neighbor. He'd followed Linda's suggestions about the lawn and the lights, even though some of them seemed petty. He'd been polite when she stopped by with her clipboard and her rules. But this was different. This wasn't about grass height or trash can placement. This was about someone taking something that belonged to him and acting like he was wrong to object. As he stood in his driveway, looking at his garage occupied by someone else's car, David realized he had a choice to make. He could let this slide, park on the street like Linda suggested, and hope she didn't make a habit of it. Or he could figure out another way to handle this situation. David looked up and down the street, noting which neighbors had their lights on. Tomorrow was Saturday. Maybe it was time to have some conversations and find out exactly what kind of person he was dealing with, because something told him this wasn't going to be a one-time thing. David woke up Saturday morning still feeling frustrated about the night before. He'd ended up parking on the street just like Linda had suggested, but he'd barely slept. Every time he looked out his window and saw that BMW still sitting in his garage, his blood pressure went up a little more. Around 8 in the morning, he decided to go for a walk around the neighborhood. Maybe some fresh air would help him figure out how to handle this situation. Plus, he was curious to see if any of his other neighbors had noticed what was going on. The first person he ran into was Tom, who lived in the house directly across the street. Tom was out watering his plants and waved when he saw David approaching. "Morning, David," Tom called out. "How's the new house treating you?" "It's good," David replied, then hesitated. "Actually, can I ask you something? Do you know much about the HOA rules around here?" Tom's expression changed immediately. He glanced around like he was checking to see if anyone was listening, then motioned for David to come closer. "Why do you ask?" Tom said quietly. "Did Linda give you trouble about something?" David was surprised by Tom's reaction. "Well, actually, yes. She parked her car in my garage last night without asking. When I went to talk to her about it, she acted like I was being unreasonable." Tom shook his head and let out a long sigh. "I was wondering when she'd try something with you. She's been testing boundaries with people ever since she declared herself HOA president." "Declared herself?" David asked. "I thought she was elected or something." "That's what she wants everyone to think," Tom said. "The truth is, our old HOA president moved away about 2 years ago, and nobody really stepped up to replace him. Linda just started acting like she was in charge, and most people went along with it because they didn't want the hassle of dealing with neighborhood stuff." Tom looked around again, then continued. "But she's been getting worse lately, especially with newer residents and—" He paused, seeming uncomfortable. "And what?" David prompted. "Look, I don't want to make this about race," Tom said carefully. "But Linda seems to have different standards for different people, if you know what I mean. She's never given me grief about my lawn being a little overgrown, but she left 3 notes for the Johnson family about their grass before they'd even finished unpacking." David felt his stomach drop. The Johnsons were the black family who'd moved in 2 months after him. He'd met them briefly and they seemed like nice people with 2 young kids. "She's done other stuff too," Tom continued. "She told the Martinez family that their decorative garden gnomes violated the community aesthetic. But old Mrs. Peterson has had plastic flamingos in her yard for 15 years and Linda's never said a word." As David walked through the neighborhood that morning, he started paying attention to things differently. He noticed that some houses had minor violations of the rules Linda had explained to him. Mailboxes that weren't the approved style, flower gardens that extended slightly beyond property lines, Halloween decorations that were still up in November. But when he thought about which neighbors had received visits from Linda, a pattern started to emerge. Around noon, David was checking his mail when he ran into Mrs. Chen. an elderly woman who lived 2 houses down from Linda. Mrs. Chen was struggling with her garbage cans, trying to drag them back up her driveway. "Here, let me help you with those," David offered, grabbing one of the heavy cans. "Thank you, dear," Mrs. Chen said gratefully. "These old bones aren't what they used to be." As they walked up her driveway, David decided to ask about Linda. "Mrs. Chen, have you had any issues with the HOA lately?" Mrs. Chen stopped walking and gave him a sharp look. "Has that woman been bothering you too?" "Something like that," David said. Mrs. Chen glanced toward Linda's house, then motioned for David to follow her onto her covered porch where they couldn't be seen from the street. "That woman has been making my life miserable for months," Mrs. Chen said, her voice shaking with anger. "She keeps leaving notes about my garden, saying my vegetables are unsightly and that I need to replace them with flowers. My late husband and I planted that garden together 40 years ago. It's all I have left of him." David felt his anger growing. "What did you tell her?" "I tried to explain that there's nothing in the actual HOA documents about vegetable gardens," Mrs. Chen said. "So you know what she did? She started calling the city, saying I was running an illegal farm in my backyard. A farm? I have 6 tomato plants and some lettuce." "That's ridiculous," David said. "It gets worse," Mrs. Chen continued. "When the city inspector came out and told her she was wasting their time, she started leaving anonymous complaints with code enforcement about my fence needing repair. There's nothing wrong with my fence, but now I have to pay for an inspector to come tell them that." As Mrs. Chen talked, David realized that Linda's behavior toward him the night before wasn't unusual. It was part of a much bigger pattern. She wasn't just an overzealous HOA president. She was someone who used her assumed authority to bully people she didn't like. "Mrs. Chen," David said carefully, "how long do you think Linda has been using my garage?" The elderly woman looked confused. "Using your garage? What do you mean?" David explained what had happened the night before. Mrs. Chen's eyes widened. "Oh my," she said. "Well, that explains some things. I've seen her fancy car parked in different driveways around the neighborhood when she has her dinner parties. I thought maybe she was carpooling with people or something." David felt his heart rate pick up. "Different driveways?" "Yes, especially when she has those big gatherings. I always wondered how she managed parking for so many cars." Mrs. Chen paused, thinking. "You know, now that I think about it, I've seen her coming and going from your direction quite a few times when you weren't home. I thought maybe you two were friends." David's mind was racing. If Linda had been using his garage regularly, that meant she had somehow gotten access to his garage door opener. But how? "Mrs. Chen, when I moved in, did the previous owner leave garage door openers with anyone in the neighborhood? For emergencies or anything like that?" "Oh, you mean Bob?" Mrs. Chen said. "Yes, he left one with Linda when he went on that long vacation last summer, before he moved. Said he wanted someone to check on the house. I guess he never asked for it back." Everything clicked into place. Linda had been using his garage for months, probably since shortly after he moved in. She'd been letting herself in whenever she needed extra parking space, assuming he'd never notice or never say anything about it. David felt a cold anger settling in his chest. This wasn't just about one night of inconsiderate parking. Linda had been violating his privacy and using his property for months, while simultaneously harassing him and other neighbors about minor rule violations. That evening, David did something he probably should have done months ago. He checked the security camera system he'd installed when he first moved in. He'd set it up mainly to monitor the front of his house while he was at work, but one of the cameras had a clear view of his garage. Going through the footage from the past 2 months, David found exactly what he was looking for. There was Linda, clear as day, using a garage door opener to let herself into his garage. The first instance was from early September, just 2 weeks after he'd moved in. Since then, she'd used his garage at least a dozen times. The footage showed her casually pulling in like she owned the place, sometimes staying for hours during her dinner parties and social gatherings. In one particularly infuriating clip, David watched her move some of his stored boxes to make more room for her SUV. As David sat in his living room, watching months of evidence of Linda's entitled behavior, he realized that talking to her hadn't worked, being polite hadn't worked, following her rules and trying to be a good neighbor hadn't earned him any respect. It was time for a different approach. David spent the rest of Saturday evening researching his options. He looked up property laws, HOA regulations, and community guidelines. He also made a list of every neighbor who had mentioned having problems with Linda. By Sunday morning, David had a plan. But first, he wanted to give Linda one more chance to do the right thing. He walked over to her house and knocked on the door. Linda answered, looking annoyed to see him again. "What now?" she said. "Linda, I need you to move your car out of my garage and give me back my garage door opener," David said calmly. "We already discussed this," Linda replied. "I told you it's just temporary." "No," David said firmly. "It's not temporary, and we both know it. I know you've been using my garage for months without my permission. I have security footage." For the first time, Linda looked uncertain. But then her expression hardened. "Even if that were true," she said, "you never complained before. And frankly, you're not using the space efficiently anyway. I'm providing a community service by managing neighborhood parking during events." David stared at her, amazed by her ability to justify her behavior. "Linda, that's my property. You don't get to decide how I use it." "Look," Linda said, her voice taking on a threatening tone. "You're new here, so maybe you don't understand how things work, but I've been maintaining community standards in this neighborhood for years. If you want to make trouble for me, I can make trouble for you too. I've already documented several violations at your property." "What violations?" David asked. Linda smiled coldly. "Oh, I'm sure I can find something. Your lawn maintenance schedule, your holiday decorating timeline, maybe some noise complaints from neighbors about late-night activities. These things have a way of adding up." As David walked back to his house, he realized that Linda had just made his decision much easier. She wasn't going to change her behavior, and she'd made it clear that she was willing to use her assumed authority to retaliate against anyone who challenged her. It was time to try a different kind of neighborhood, communication. David spent Sunday evening thinking about his conversation with Linda. Her threat to manufacture HOA violations against him had crossed a line. This wasn't just about parking anymore. It was about someone using their assumed authority to intimidate and control their neighbors. As he sat at his kitchen table, looking through the security camera footage again, an idea started forming in his mind. Linda's biggest weakness was her sense of entitlement. She genuinely believed she had the right to use his garage, and she'd made it clear she wasn't going to stop voluntarily. But what if she couldn't access his garage anymore? And what if he wasn't around to deal with her inevitable tantrum? David had been planning to visit his sister Kelly in Denver for months. She'd been asking him to come see her new apartment, and he'd accumulated plenty of vacation time at work. He'd been putting off the trip because of various responsibilities. But suddenly a vacation seemed like the perfect solution to his Linda problem. Monday morning, David called his boss and explained that he needed to take some emergency vacation time to help a family member. His supervisor was understanding. David rarely took time off and had covered for other people countless times. Next, David called Kelly. "Hey sis, remember how you've been bugging me to visit? How does this week sound?" "This week?" Kelly laughed. "That's pretty short notice even for you. What's going on?" David explained the situation with Linda and his plan. Kelly, who worked in property management and dealt with difficult people regularly, was immediately on board. "Oh, this is perfect," Kelly said. "I can't wait to hear how this turns out. And yes, absolutely come visit. I'll take some time off work and we can explore the city." David's next stop was the hardware store. He needed a heavy-duty padlock, something that would secure his garage door and couldn't be easily cut or broken. The store clerk recommended a hardened steel padlock with a thick shackle, the kind used for storage units and construction sites. "This thing will stop bolt cutters," the clerk said approvingly. "What are you securing?" "Just want to make sure my garage stays private," David replied. While he was at the store, David also picked up a small security camera specifically designed for garage doors. He wanted to capture whatever happened after he locked Linda's car inside. Tuesday morning, David watched from his window as Linda left for what Mrs. Chen had told him was her regular yoga class. Linda drove a small sedan for her daily activities, saving the BMW for special occasions and apparently taking up other people's garage space. As soon as Linda's car disappeared around the corner, David went to work. First, he installed the new security camera where it would have a clear view of his garage door. Then he attached the heavy-duty padlock to the garage door track, making it impossible to open from either the inside or outside without the key. The BMW was now trapped inside his garage. David stood back and admired his work. The padlock looked serious and permanent. Even if Linda tried to cut it off, she'd need professional tools and plenty of time. Next, David packed his bags and loaded his car. Before leaving for the airport, he composed an email to send to the neighborhood email list that Linda had insisted everyone join for community communication. The email was carefully worded and completely factual. Dear neighbors, I wanted to let everyone know that I'll be out of town for the next 10 days visiting family in Colorado. During this time, I won't be available by phone or email as I'm taking a much-needed break from technology. I've secured my garage with a padlock to ensure my property remains safe while I'm away. I discovered that someone has been using my garage regularly, without my knowledge or permission, so I've taken steps to prevent any further unauthorized access. I've attached security camera footage showing multiple instances of this unauthorized use over the past several weeks. I believe in being transparent with neighbors about property issues that affect our community. For anyone who might be inconvenienced by my security measures, I encourage you to remember that private property rights are fundamental to our neighborhood's stability. I look forward to discussing any concerns when I return. I hope everyone has a wonderful week and a half. Best regards, David. David attached several clear screenshots from his security footage showing Linda entering and exiting his garage, making sure to include timestamps that proved this had been going on for months. He scheduled the email to send automatically in 2 hours, giving him time to get to the airport and board his plane. By the time Linda discovered her car was trapped, David would be somewhere over Kansas. As David's plane took off Tuesday afternoon, he felt lighter than he had in months. For the first time since moving to the neighborhood, he wasn't worried about what Linda might do next or what new rules she might try to enforce. Whatever happened over the next 10 days, he wouldn't be there to deal with it. Kelly picked him up at Denver International Airport with a huge grin on her face. I can't believe you actually did it, she said as they drove toward the city. You locked your car in your garage and just left town? Technically, I secured my private property and went on a planned vacation, David said with a smile. What happens to anyone who is using my property without permission is not my responsibility. Oh, you are definitely related to me, Kelly laughed. This is exactly the kind of petty justice I live for. David's phone had been buzzing with notifications since he landed, but he decided to leave it on airplane mode. Whatever messages were waiting for him could stay there until he was ready to deal with them. Wednesday morning, Kelly convinced David to go hiking in the Rocky Mountains. As they climbed a beautiful trail with stunning views of snow-capped peaks, David felt more relaxed than he had in months. The stress of dealing with Linda's entitled behavior seemed far away. You know what I love about this plan? Kelly said as they sat on a rock outcropping, eating sandwiches and looking out over the valley below. She can't even blame you for being petty or vindictive. You just secured your own property and went on vacation. It's perfectly reasonable. That's the beauty of it, David agreed. I'm not doing anything to her. I'm just protecting my own stuff and taking care of myself. Thursday evening, David finally turned his phone back on to check in with work. He had 47 missed calls, 36 text messages, and 89 emails. Most of them seemed to be from numbers he didn't recognize, probably neighbors who'd gotten his contact information from someone else. David scrolled through a few of the messages. They ranged from supportive, good for you, from Tom across the street, to concerned, please call me when you get this from Mrs. Chen, to what appeared to be increasingly frantic messages from Linda herself. Linda's first text, sent Tuesday afternoon, was relatively calm. David, there seems to be some kind of problem with your garage door. Please call me. By Wednesday, her tone had changed. This is ridiculous. You can't just lock my car in your garage. I need my vehicle. Thursday's messages were getting desperate. I've called a locksmith, but they won't help me. This is harassment, and I'm considering legal action. David showed the messages to Kelly, who read them with growing amusement. Legal action? Kelly said. For what? Using your own garage. Apparently, Linda has a very different understanding of property rights than most people, David replied. Friday morning, David and Kelly were exploring downtown Denver when David's phone rang. The caller ID showed it was Tom from across the street. David, thank God you answered, Tom said when David picked up. Dude, you have got to see what's happening in the neighborhood. Linda has completely lost it. What do you mean? David asked. She's been going door to door since Tuesday trying to get people to force you to come back and unlock your garage. Yesterday she called the police, but they told her it was a civil matter since it's your property. Then she tried to get a locksmith to cut your padlock, but when he found out the situation, he refused to help her. David could hear the amusement in Tom's voice as he continued. But here's the best part. Your email with the security footage has been shared all over the neighborhood. Facebook groups. People are taking screenshots and sharing it with the caption, "This is how you handle an entitled neighbor." Linda's become like a neighborhood legend, but not in a good way. How is she handling that? David asked. About as well as you'd expect, Tom said. She's been sending these long, rambling emails to the neighborhood list defending herself and demanding that people stop sharing private community business online. But that's just making people share it more. David felt a mix of satisfaction and mild concern. He'd wanted to make a point, but he hadn't intended to completely humiliate Linda. Is she okay, though? David asked. I mean, I don't want her to have a breakdown or anything. She's fine, Tom reassured him. Angry and embarrassed, but fine. Actually, I think this might be the wake-up call she needed. A lot of neighbors are finally speaking up about her behavior now that someone stood up to her. That evening, David and Kelly were having dinner at a rooftop restaurant with an incredible view of the mountains, when David's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The message was from Janet, who lived 4 houses down from him. David, I hope you're having a wonderful vacation. I wanted you to know that several of us neighbors have been talking, and we're planning to officially reorganize the HOA when you get back. Linda's behavior this week has shown everyone what we've been dealing with. Your security footage was the evidence we needed to document the pattern of harassment. Thank you for having the courage to stand up to her. Enjoy Colorado. David showed the message to Kelly, who raised her wine glass in a toast. To strategic vacation timing, she said with a grin. To standing up for yourself without starting a war, David replied, clinking his glass against hers. As they sat there watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of orange and pink, David realized that sometimes the best way to handle a bully isn't to fight them directly. Sometimes you just need to let them face the natural consequences of their actions while you're somewhere beautiful, drinking good wine and enjoying life. He had 5 more days of vacation left, and he planned to enjoy every minute of them. Back in the neighborhood, Linda's Tuesday had started like any other day. She'd gone to her yoga class, stopped by the organic market for some specialty ingredients for dinner, and was looking forward to a quiet afternoon organizing her spice cabinet. She had no idea that her world was about to turn upside down. When Linda pulled into her driveway around noon, she noticed something odd. There were several neighbors standing in small groups on the sidewalk, and they seemed to be looking in the direction of David's house. Mrs. Peterson from down the street was holding her phone and showing something too. Mr. Rodriguez. Linda didn't think much of it until she tried to check on her BMW. She'd planned to take it to get detailed that afternoon in preparation for her book club meeting on Thursday. But when she walked over to David's garage, she found something that made her stop dead in her tracks. There was a heavy-duty padlock securing the garage door. Not just any padlock. This thing looked like it belonged on a bank vault. The garage door was completely immobilized. Linda stared at the padlock for a full minute, trying to process what she was seeing. Then she tried pulling on it, thinking maybe it was just decorative or not properly secured. But the lock held firm. Her BMW was trapped inside. Her first instinct was to call David. Surely this was some kind of misunderstanding. Maybe he'd had a security issue and locked the garage temporarily, forgetting that her car was inside. It was an inconvenience, but these things happened. But David's phone went straight to voicemail. Linda le bien s'attendon. Fight a polite message explaining the situation and asking him to call her back as soon as possible. When she didn't hear back within an hour, Linda started to feel the first stirrings of panic. She had dinner plans that evening, and she'd specifically told her friends she'd pick them up in the BMW because it was more comfortable for long drives. Linda called David again, this time leaving a more urgent message. Still no response. By 3 o'clock, Linda was pacing around her house, alternating between calling David and staring out her window at his garage. She'd tried calling his work, but they told her he was out of the office on family emergency leave. That's when Linda's phone buzzed with an email notification. It was from the neighborhood email list. A message from David with the subject line, temporary absence and property security. As Linda read David's email, her confusion turned to disbelief, then to anger. He'd attached security footage showing her using his garage, and he was claiming she'd been doing it without permission. But that was ridiculous. She'd been managing neighborhood parking for community events. She was providing a service. Linda immediately started typing a response email, but then she stopped. The footage was pretty clear, and David's email made her look, well, it made her look bad. She needed to think about how to handle this strategically. Instead of responding publicly, Linda decided to go door to door to explain her side of the story. Surely once the neighbors understood that she'd been trying to help manage parking during social gatherings, they'd see that David was being unreasonable. Her first stop was Tom's house across the street. When Tom answered the door, his expression was carefully neutral. "Hi, Tom," Linda said, putting on her brightest smile. "I'm sure you saw David's email. I wanted to explain what really happened." "Oh, I saw it," Tom said. "Pretty clear footage." "Well, yes, but you have to understand the context," Linda continued. "I've been coordinating neighborhood parking during social events. David never parks in his garage anyway, so I was just making efficient use of available space. I've been doing this kind of community resource management for years." Tom nodded slowly. "Uh-huh. And did you ask David if you could use his garage for this community resource management?" Linda felt her smile falter slightly. "Well, no, but he never seemed to mind. And honestly, as HOA president, I have to make executive decisions sometimes for the good of the community." "Linda," Tom said gently, "I don't think you're actually the HOA president, and even if you were, I don't think that would give you the right to use someone else's garage without asking." Linda left Tom's house feeling shaken. His response wasn't what she'd expected. Usually when she mentioned her HOA authority, people backed down. Her next stop was Mrs. Peterson's house. Mrs. Peterson had always been supportive of Linda's efforts to maintain neighborhood standards, but when Mrs. Peterson answered the door, she was holding her phone and didn't look pleased to see Linda. "I just watched your little home movie," Mrs. Peterson said before Linda could speak. "Going through someone's garage like you own the place. I have to say, Linda, I'm disappointed." "It's not what it looks like," Linda said quickly. "I was managing parking for community events. David never used that space anyway." "That's not the point," Mrs. Peterson replied. "You can't just take someone's property without asking, no matter how you try to justify it. What if someone had been doing that to your garage?" Linda tried to explain about community resource management and efficient space utilization, but Mrs. Peterson just shook her head. "Linda, you need to stop talking and start listening. That young man trusted you enough to be polite when you've been bothering him about his lawn and his Christmas lights. And this is how you repaid that trust?" By Wednesday afternoon, Linda had visited 8 houses and gotten essentially the same response from everyone. Nobody seemed to understand that she'd been providing a community service. Instead, they were all focused on the technicality of permission and property rights. Even worse, Linda discovered that David's email had been shared beyond the neighborhood. Someone had posted screenshots on the local community Facebook page, and it was getting dozens of comments and shares. People were calling it the Great Garage Lockout and using laughing emojis. Linda tried to post her own explanation on Facebook, detailing her history of community service and explaining the context of the parking situation. But her post just seemed to generate more negative comments. People were saying things like, "Entitled much?" and "Karen got what she deserved." By Thursday, Linda was getting desperate. She'd called 3 different locksmiths, but when she explained the situation, they all declined to help. One of them even laughed and said, "Lady, I'm not helping you break into someone else's garage. That's how I lose my license." Linda tried calling the police again, but the officer she spoke to was less patient than the first one had been. "Ma'am, we've already explained this to you. It's his garage, it's his lock, and it's his property. If you left your car somewhere without permission and now you can't get it back, that's a civil matter." "But I need my car," Linda said, her voice rising. "I have appointments and obligations." "Then maybe you should have thought of that before you parked in someone else's garage without asking," the officer replied. The worst part was that Linda's husband, Robert, was starting to lose patience with the whole situation. He'd been traveling for work when everything started, but when he came home Wednesday night and found out what had happened, he was not sympathetic. "Let me get this straight," Robert said, sitting at their kitchen table with his head in his hands. "You've been parking your car in the neighbor's garage for months without asking him, And now you're surprised that he locked you out? I was managing community parking, Linda said for what felt like the 100th time. It's called being neighborly. Linda, being neighborly is asking before you use someone's property, Robert said. What you did is called trespassing. Robert had seen the Facebook posts at work. Apparently, the story had spread far enough that his co-workers were sharing it. He was embarrassed and frustrated, and he made it clear that he thought Linda had brought this on herself. Friday morning, Linda was standing in her driveway staring at David's garage when Mrs. Chen approached her. Linda, dear, Mrs. Chen said in a kind but firm voice, I think you need to step back and really think about this situation. I don't know what you mean, Linda said stiffly. I mean that maybe this is a chance for you to understand how other people have been feeling when you show up at their door with complaints and demands. Mrs. Chen said, you've spent months telling people what they can and can't do with their property. Now someone has done something with their property that affects you and you don't like it. Linda started to protest, but Mrs. Chen held up her hand. I'm not finished, Mrs. Chen continued. You've made that poor young man's life difficult since the day he moved in. You've harassed me about my garden, threatened other neighbors with made-up violations, and acted like you own this entire neighborhood. Maybe it's time to consider that your actions have consequences. As Mrs. Chen walked away, Linda felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time. Doubt. Not about being right. She was still convinced that her community resource management had been reasonable, but doubt about whether other people would ever understand her perspective. Saturday afternoon, Linda was in her backyard trying to distract herself with gardening when she heard a commotion from the street. Looking over her fence, she saw a small crowd gathered around David's garage. Someone had a camera out and appeared to be taking pictures of the padlock. Linda walked closer and realized it was a local news reporter with a cameraman. Apparently, someone had tipped them off about the story, and they were doing a segment about neighborhood disputes. The reporter was interviewing Tom, who was explaining the situation with obvious enjoyment. So this neighbor had been using his garage without permission for months, the reporter asked. That's right, Tom said. She just assumed she could use his private property whenever she wanted. Then when he secured his own garage and went on vacation, she called the police and tried to get locksmiths to break his lock. The reporter turned to the camera. We reached out to the property owner for comment, but he's currently on vacation and unavailable. However, neighbors tell us this is just the latest incident in a pattern of alleged HOA overreach that has affected multiple residents in this quiet suburban community. Linda watched from behind her fence, feeling sick to her stomach. This was spinning completely out of control. What had started as a simple parking arrangement had somehow become a news story about HOA abuse and property rights. That evening, Robert found Linda sitting in their living room with the lights off, staring out the window toward David's garage. The local news picked up the story, Robert said quietly, sitting down beside her. It's going to be on the 10 o'clock broadcast. Linda didn't respond. For the first time since this whole thing started, she was beginning to understand that she might have made a serious mistake. Not just with David's garage, but with the way she'd been treating the entire neighborhood. What do I do now? Linda asked, her voice small. You wait for David to come back, Robert said. And then you apologize. Really apologize? And you hope he's a more forgiving person than you've been to him. As Linda sat in the dark watching the padlock glint in the streetlight, she realized that her 10 days of waiting were going to feel a lot longer than David's 10 days of vacation. David's flight back from Denver landed on a crisp Friday afternoon, exactly 10 days after he'd left. As Kelly had driven him to the airport that morning, she'd made him promise to call and tell her how everything turned out. I'm almost sad to see you go, Kelly had said. This has been the most entertaining vacation I've ever hosted. My friends are all asking for updates on the garage situation. David had spent his last few days in Colorado mostly offline, enjoying hiking trails and mountain views. He'd resisted the urge to check his phone constantly, though he had noticed that the number of missed calls and messages seemed to be growing daily. As David drove home from the airport, he felt a mix of anticipation and anxiety. He had no idea what he was about to walk into, but based on the sheer volume of messages on his phone, it was clearly something significant. Turning onto his street, David immediately noticed that something was different. There were more people outside than usual for a Friday afternoon, and several of them waved when they saw his car. Tom was washing his car in his driveway and gave David an enthusiastic thumbs up. David parked in his driveway, the same spot he'd been using for months while Linda occupied his garage, and walked over to assess his handiwork. The padlock was exactly where he'd left it, looking as secure as ever. But there was something new. Someone had left a small bouquet of flowers next to the garage door with a note that read, "Welcome home, hero." As David was examining the flowers, Mrs. Chen appeared at his side as if she'd been waiting for him. "David, dear, you're back," she said, looking genuinely happy to see him. "How was your vacation?" "It was great," David replied. "Very relaxing." "How have things been here?" Mrs. Chen's eyes twinkled with mischief. "Oh, eventful. Very eventful. Linda has had quite the week." Before David could ask for details, Tom jogged over from across the street. "Dude," Tom said, slightly out of breath from excitement. "You have got to hear what's been happening. This has been better than any TV show." David looked around and noticed that other neighbors were starting to emerge from their houses, like they'd been watching for his return. Even the Martinez family from down the street was walking over with their kids. "Should I be worried?" David asked. "Only if you're worried about becoming a neighborhood legend," Tom laughed. "Linda completely melted down while you were gone." "It was spectacular," Mrs. Chen nodded. "She spent 3 days going door to door trying to get people to force you to come back. Then she called the police twice, tried to hire locksmiths, and even contacted a lawyer who apparently laughed at her and refused to take her case. But the best part," Tom continued, "is that your email got shared all over social media. Someone tipped off the local news and they did a story about it. They called it the Great Garage Standoff and interviewed half the neighborhood about Linda's HOA overreach." David felt his stomach drop slightly. "The news? I didn't want this to become a big public thing." "Don't worry," Mrs. Chen said quickly. "Everyone was very supportive of you. The story actually helped people understand that Linda's behavior wasn't normal or acceptable. A lot of neighbors started sharing their own stories about her harassment." Janet approached the group carrying what looked like an official document. "David, welcome back," she said warmly. "I hope you got my text about reorganizing the HOA. "I saw it, but I haven't had a chance to read through all my messages yet," David replied. Janet smiled. "Well, I have good news. We've officially filed paperwork to establish a legitimate HOA board with proper elections and bylaws. Linda's reign of terror is officially over." "Reign of terror?" David asked. "That's what people have been calling it," Tom said. "Once your situation got people talking, everyone started sharing stories about Linda's behavior. Turns out she's been harassing pretty much every minority family in the neighborhood, making up fake violations, and threatening people who disagreed with her." Mrs. Martinez stepped forward with her husband and children. "David, we wanted to thank you," she said. "Linda made our first months here miserable with her complaints about our decorations and our children's toys. But your situation gave us the courage to document everything and speak up." David was starting to feel overwhelmed by the attention. "I really didn't do anything special. I just secured my own property." "That's exactly why it was so perfect," Janet said. "You didn't attack her or escalate the conflict. You just protected yourself and let her behavior speak for itself." "Speaking of Linda," Tom said, looking toward her house, "she's been pretty quiet the last few days. I think the news story really shook her up." "Where is she now?" David asked. "Inside, as far as we know," Mrs. Chen said. "She stopped coming outside after the news crew left. Her husband has been doing all the errands and walking their dog." David looked toward Linda's house, which appeared quiet and closed up despite the nice weather. For the first time since planning his garage strategy, he felt a twinge of guilt. He'd wanted to make a point, not completely humiliate someone. "I should probably unlock the garage and let her get her car," David said. "That's up to you," Tom said. "But you might want to know that her car has 3 parking tickets on it. Street cleaning happened twice while you were gone and she couldn't move it." David walked over to his garage with his key to the padlock. The crowd of neighbors followed at a respectful distance, clearly curious to see the resolution of their week-long entertainment. As David removed the padlock and began raising the garage door, he heard a front door slam. Looking toward Linda's house, he saw her practically running across the yards toward his garage. Linda looked different than David remembered. Her usually perfect hair was messy, she wasn't wearing makeup, and her clothes looked like she'd slept in them. More importantly, her usual confident demeanor was completely gone. "David," Linda said, stopping a few feet away from him. "You're back." I am, David said calmly. I see you've been having some trouble accessing your car. Linda glanced around at all the neighbors watching the interaction, and David saw something in her expression that he'd never seen before. Genuine shame. David, I need to apologize, Linda said, her voice barely above a whisper. I was wrong. About everything. The neighbors fell silent, clearly surprised by Linda's tone. David had expected anger, demands, or threats. He hadn't expected this. Linda, you don't have to do this in front of everyone, David said gently. Yes, I do, Linda replied, looking around at the gathered neighbors. I owe everyone an apology. I've been terrible to live near. I know that now. Linda turned back to David. I convinced myself that I was helping the neighborhood by managing things and maintaining standards. But really, I was just controlling people and making them miserable. Your garage was just the latest example of me taking something that wasn't mine and justifying it to myself. David nodded, feeling some of his anger dissolving. I appreciate you saying that. The last 10 days have been eye-opening, Linda continued. Having everyone in the neighborhood angry at me, seeing my behavior from the outside through news coverage, listening to my husband tell me how embarrassed he is, I realized that I've become someone I don't like very much.